Chapter 6. As the night wore on, at least half of the females had left, their fatigue surpassing their interest in competing for the crown. Nina, who had just returned from her dance with the group at the center, appeared exhausted from all the effort she had put in to get his attention. Hannah had been dancing with the group she was with at the beginning of the night, continuing to enjoy herself. "I can't wait to be queen," Nina commented from a self-evident future that existed in her fantasies. "Any girl would be lucky to be queen," Hannah admiringly said as she gazed at the prince from afar. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Nina jokingly stated. The two laughed. Nina's ended before her own. Her face immediately grew serious. Hannah had never seen her wear such an expression. She turned her head and realized what caused Nina to become defensive and solemn. The song ended and a slow, magical tune started. Squeals could be heard from the center of the room, as girls fought to be the first partner of the prince. A slow dance. The man with golden hair and amber eyes approached and extended his hand to Hannah. "May I have this dance?" he asked. Hannah peered at him, then at Nina. Nina did not shift her eyes from the man in front of them. Her serious expression seemed to be transforming into anger. Given no social cue from Nina, and the feeling of fear returning, Hannah placed her hand in his own. "I don't want for you to feel as though you are forced to dance," he added with a sympathetic grin. "It's fine," Hannah responded. Nina said nothing. As he led her to the dance floor, Nina stared after them. Hannah understood she saw it. His ring. The one she had told her about. Nina knew who this man was. But why anger? Was she upset that he may ruin the evening? Or was there another problem with the encounter? Hannah glanced around. Some of the knights had found partners in the girls that had missed their opportunity to dance with the prince. The fortunate lady pressed herself close to the prince, her head resting on his shoulder. The prince appeared rather uncomfortable, peering around at the others. He and Hannah locked eyes for a moment, and she shared a brief, supportive half-grin with him. He released a brief, breath-filled chuckle, then moved his eyes to the ruby sorcerer. Though dressed in matching attire to his knights, the prince squinted, unable to identify him. The ruby sorcerer turned to Hannah and bowed. She curtsied in response, and they took up their position for the slow dance. She took a deep breath in before releasing it in a soothing exhale. Her heart had not the energy left to cause a ferocious nervousness within her, and yet Hannah couldn't decide if she feared him any more. She knew he was dangerous. However, unlike the other sorcerer, his presence emitted no hostility or ill will, but rather the opposite. She understood he may be deceiving her into a false sense of security, but if that were the case, she couldn't help but fall under his spell. His voice and his manner calmed her, their dancing smooth and enchanting to all who looked upon them. The sorcerer glanced over Hannah's shoulder and saw Nina continuing to glare in the direction. He grinned. "I feel rude for not introducing myself to you earlier," he said. Hannah could not decipher whether earlier meant in the evening or earlier in the week. "My name is Seer, and yours?" "Hannah," she answered, her voice as calm as his own. "Hannah," he repeated. Her heart accelerated and the butterflies returned to her stomach. She didn't know if it was fear or an unrestrained curiosity that forced her to question his motives, but she did not fight to withhold the words. "Why are you here?" Their eyes met. Her eyes were wide, her expression inquisitive. Seer closed his eyes, sifting through his thoughts to find a proper answer. His smile slowly transformed into a frown. "I'm not sure if you know of the politics of Wyvernon, but recently there was an amendment laid out in the United Court of Kings. The court includes 5 nations, one of which is the Kingdom of Wyvernon. With the death of the king," at this, Seer shifted his eyes to look at the prince, who continued to be swarmed by ladies. "His son is meant to take his place within the court. This would be no problem, except for their differing ideals." Seer went immediately silent. His eyes focused in urgency behind Hannah, and he realized the conflict he had walked into. Nina, who had long glared in their direction, was now talking with several of the knights and the royal advisor, pointing directly at them. A look of shock and anger appeared on the royal advisor and knights' face, and they began their move toward Hannah and Seer. "I'm afraid I must be going," Seer whispered. but Hannah held onto his hand. After a moment, he broke free of her grip and briskly walked away. Without knowing why, Hannah followed after him. As they exited the banquet hall, Hannah could hear the outcries behind her. "You didn't answer my question," she shouted at Seer. She could not understand why her feet continued to move after him. Her mind had forgotten where she was, and the raucous shouts faded to no more than a whisper. "A disease is spreading," Seer called back while continuing to move forward, his pace accelerating. Hannah found she was running to keep up. "It's a spell meant to kill an entire town before the bacteria itself dies off. Anyone within the border of Wickborough will die if the prince does not repeal his opinion of the amendment within the United Court. It's a threat, or soon, revenge if the amendment is passed." The two climbed the stairs, the clash of weaponry, a fresh sound following not far behind. They exited through the arch and onto the parapet walkway. To Hannah's surprise, Seer knew where he was going. "How can we stop it?" "You can't," Seer answered. Hannah felt slightly offended by his answer, but understood his honesty was not meant as an insult. "It's birthed through magic and must be exterminated through magic. I've been trying to keep up, but I'm afraid of interception, of someone attempting to stop me." "But who?" Hannah wondered. The first image to pop into her head was of the emerald-cloaked sorcerer. Though based solely in instinct, her heart sank, and a sudden terror overcame her, his hostility accompanied by a malevolent grin. She knew it was him, and she couldn't be convinced otherwise. "Stop right there!" a knight of the castle yelled at them, as if his order were enough to stop them in their tracks. Seer grimaced and turned through a doorway. It was no more than a small, empty room that led to a balcony. "Listen," Seer directed at Hannah, her eyes connected with his. "If you see a light shining from the broken lamp in the market district, you need to gather your family and friends and leave town as quickly as possible. There is a cabin outside of the east border of Wickborough. Seek shelter there." He walked out onto the balcony. Hannah stood frozen. "But why are you telling me this?" she asked. Seer smiled, one of those comforting smiles from earlier. "Because you didn't run away when you found out who I was." He climbed onto the ledge of the balcony and gazed up at the stars which filled the sky. Having been inside, Hannah hadn't realized how late it had gotten. The guards, knights, and a mass of onlookers reached the door of the room they had entered. Seer looked at them and tilted his head to the side, sharing a playful smile with them. Hannah continued to stare at him, a shock filling her thoughts. Seer turned back to look at the city, which glowed in the night. "Don't you move," the leading guard commanded. Seer released a brief chuckle before casually walking off the ledge. His entire person began falling to the ground below. Hannah's body hadn't reacted until she noticed his head disappear over the rail. "Seer!" she cried out and ran onto the balcony. The others rushed to her side and tried to get a peek, many believing they'd see his splattered body below. But, to their surprise, he had completely disappeared. Hannah searched the ground before looking to the sky, not knowing if the abilities of a sorcerer included flight. He was gone. The crowd that had gathered expressed their shock, but many of them beginning to feel fear. But the nerves were calmed by the knights and guards who guaranteed the safety of all within the castle. The leading knight turned to one of his comrades and stated, "Take a group and go search the ground below. He couldn't have gotten far. If you find him, restrain him before locking him in a cell to receive judgment." Since the knight had spent no effort in whispering, Hannah clearly heard every word. She wanted to defend Seer, but she realized defending herself in the situation may be the top priority. After all, she was left on a balcony, surrounded by guards with no chance of escape, and many may feel she was an accomplice to the crime he committed. The knight turned to her, and, studying his face, noticed it to be the knight she first danced with during the dance of the enchantress. "That man," he began, referring to Seer. "He was a sorcerer, correct?" "Yes," Hannah responded. She knew she mustn't lie, not to a royal knight. "And you're aware he was breaking the law by entering this castle without the prince's or the advisor's consent?" "Yes." "How did he get in?" "I don't know." "What did he want?" Hannah paused and looked to the ground. She did not know how to answer the question. Not that she didn't wish to warn them of the infringing plague, but because she didn't want to further incriminate herself. Also, she did not know if they would believe her, for the idea itself seemed rather absurd. Fortunately, the royal advisor entered the room before she was forced to respond. He wore an ill-tempered expression. His quickened pace demonstrated his impatience. "The prince would like a word with the girl," the royal advisor stated. The knight appeared shocked, but accepted the command. Hannah's stomach filled with nerves once more, and her body began to shake. When they entered the throne room, she noticed a familiar purple dress standing in line near the front. Though the person had their back turned to her, Hannah knew who it was. A mix of emotions seemed to hit her in that moment, the worst of which was betrayal. Hannah was forced down the aisle and towards the throne. When standing about 10 feet behind the line of people, the two knights on either side of her pushed her to the ground. It was not pain she felt from the act, but humiliation. The line split down the middle, and Hannah saw the prince looking down upon her. His face, unlike the advisor's, did not appear angry, but rather confused. Hannah peered into his eyes for a moment before closing her own. The possibilities of what would happen next were only negative in the context of her thoughts. She would bring shame on herself, her family, and the bakery. Though Nina's body rotated to face Hannah, her head stayed turned away, unable to look upon her fallen friend. The royal advisor joined the prince at his side, squinting in examination of Hannah. "Give us your name," he commanded in an authoritative tone. "Hannah Baker." "Any history with magic?" "No." With this answer, Hannah let out a whimper. She knew the punishments given to sorcerers were often the most severe, next to mass murder and treason. "Did you know the man you were with?" Hannah paused, not knowing how to respond without incriminating herself. "Answer the question." "No," she answered. She hoped that a distinction between knowledge of a person and familiarity of them would allow her to feel this was an honest response. To answer the question with utmost truth would require some explanation, but she could tell the advisor's patience was close to running out. "You're lying," a familiar, shaky voice added in a mumble. Hannah looked up and saw the tears streaming from Nina's eyes. Hannah's jaw fell open in shock. Her best friend, the one person she had trusted for years, called her a liar in front of the royal court. "Nina, are you lying?" the advisor questioned in an offended tone. "No, I mean yes or no. You don't understand. Answer the question." "No! You dare lie to the court!" At this, Hannah broke down. Her heart raced. Her erratic breathing made it difficult to calm herself. The tears formed floods down her face. What had happened to life's simplicity? Was it gone? Had she betrayed herself by getting involved with something outside of her necessity? The advisor glared at Hannah's crumbled form, a repulsed expression on his face. The prince looked as if he pitied her. The royal advisor was about to speak, but the prince held up his hand to stop him. "Hannah," he began, in a calm voice. She looked up at him, her eyes glittering but no longer flooded. "Are you hurt?" A shock covered the face of everyone within the room, Hannah included. She shook her head. The prince shared a grin. "Please stand." Hannah rose to her feet. The knights who had pushed her down stepped back. Her eyes circled the room, hesitating to move from Nina, who refused to look at her. Hannah felt her heart sink. "Miss Mason, this is your friend, correct? She does not appear manipulated or under a spell to you?" the prince asked Nina. Quivering, she looked up and examined Hannah, her eyes barely open. "I'm not sure," Nina responded. "I'd have to ask some questions." Hannah shook her head in shock, unable to believe that Nina couldn't see her, the true her, standing there. "Nina," she pleaded, "it's me. How can I be sure? You've been acting strange ever since you first saw them in the market district." "They were in the market district?" the royal advisor exclaimed, appalled. "Yes," said Hannah in response to the advisor. "But Nina, you know how nervous I was. I was terrified for my life. I told you. All you did was think about it," Nina said, anger evident in her voice. "You completely ignored me when we were trying to pick out our dresses, and tonight you abandoned me to dance with a sorcerer. Nina, you claimed to be nervous and scared, and yet you just leave me behind? I wanted to help you, but you didn't listen. You told me to ignore it," Hannah responded, defiant in tone. She could not believe what was happening. Her friendship was falling apart in the eyes of everyone around, in front of the royal court. Her best friend accused her of helping the sorcerer of her own free will, or at least That's how she made it seem. Though Nina enjoyed attention and storytelling, Hannah had hoped she would have known better than to dramatize a retelling in front of the royal court. The cost could be her life. Hannah needed to defend herself, something she was unaccustomed to doing. Unfortunately, with her lack of self-confidence, she was already finding it difficult. "Ignore, not walk towards," Nina retorted. "Why didn't you tell the guards? You know when you first noticed it was him?" Hannah was speechless. She couldn't think of an honest response to this question that would make her any less responsible for the events that followed. Could she tell them what he told her? Or would that force them to believe she was his accomplice? "I understand your life was mundane before, but the second something slightly interesting happened to you, you completely changed. I don't know if it's the real you or not," Nina stated in a distressed voice, as if she was the one suffering for all that was transpiring. Hannah felt the tears returning. "Nina," Hannah started in a quiet voice, "do you remember when we were younger? How we used to steal cookies from the bakery? You convinced me it would be fine, even though you knew I was terrified. I trusted in you. I trusted that everything would be okay." "Hannah, stop. And then, one day, my grandfather caught you with a half-eaten raisin cookie in your back pocket. I defended you. I told him it was my idea, that you were like family and it would be okay. You were nervous because we were so young, but he ended up forgiving us, and Hannah, we never did it again. Do you remember?" Hannah asked, staring at Nina, who had closed her eyes. There was a silence. No one in the room dared to disrupt it. Hannah pleaded, "It's me, Nina. It's me. Hannah, your best friend since childhood. Please, convince them of that." Hannah felt her heartbeat escaping her control. "They'll kill me unless you convince them otherwise. I did nothing wrong." "I believe I've heard enough," the prince interrupted, a wide smile on his face. "I believe we've all had a long night. Return home, the two of you. We'll resume our questioning tomorrow." Hannah felt relieved, grateful to the prince's mercy. Nina quickly walked past Hannah and toward the door, not wishing to see Hannah's face. As Hannah turned to leave, the prince added, "If you do not return, I'll have no choice but to consider you an accomplice." "Understood," Hannah replied with a grin, expressing her gratefulness and a bow of her head. She wiped the remaining tears from her eyes. Upon seeing the advisor's face, her expression became serious, knowing that convincing him of her innocence would be all the harder. As she returned home, her breathing calmed under the beauty of the stars. After all, she was innocent. She had not helped Seer in any way, nor did she break any laws. However, the warnings of Seer echoed in her mind as she walked. A fear entered her, sending a chill up her spine, and the image of the Emerald Sorcerer returned.